Wir sind der Rotten Rumor Podcast, ein Schulprojekt, das wir nach dem Projekt Leadership for Change von The Economist gestaltet haben. Mit unserem Podcast wollen wir die verschiedenen Seiten einer Situation, ob politisch, ökonomisch oder anderweit darstellen. Dies wollen wir dadurch tun, dass jeder von uns eine andere Position im politischen Spektrum einnimmt und die Meinung dieser bei Debatten ausdrückt.
Die heutige Folge wird über Zohran Mamdani sein, der neue Bürgermeister von New York. Dies wird auch eine spezielle Folge sein, da wir dies auf Englisch machen. Viel Spaß beim Zuhören.
Zohran Mamdani has recently become the mayor of New York City, garnering 54% of votes. Being a self-proclaimed democratic socialist, therefore differing from the former Republican mayor, Eric L. Adams, quite a bit, and having been threatened by President Donald J. Trump that if he became mayor, all funding from the state towards New York would cease immediately, he still managed to win the race.
So how did he pull this off?
First off, his campaign was easily accessible, with a lot of his goals as mayor and planned projects being presented on various social media platforms for anyone anywhere to see. He gathered quite a lot of online fans. A mayor with completely new goals is exactly what everyone wants when their country is in a crisis, as we have seen many times throughout history. The bright colors used throughout his videos and his campaign website are eye-catching, together with the bold fonts and catchy editing of his videos. This boosted his presence a lot. It also caused that after his election, people all around the world started taking part in a "That's my mayor" trend when speaking of or stitching videos of Mamdani. When interacting with people and even when giving speeches, he comes off as charismatic and sociable, not directly insulting his opponents, and showing a willingness to cooperate with people of different opinions shows maturity that isn't seen very often, especially in more extremist parties and candidates. These attributes continue to be seen even after his election, meaning they were not just for show. For example, in a meeting with President Donald J. Trump shortly after his election, he remained civil and even stated thereafter that it was a productive meeting. Still, when being asked whether he still believes Trump to be a fascist by NBC, as he stated before his election, he answered yes. His background is also relatable to many in a diverse city like New York. Being an immigrant from Uganda himself and having to move often during his childhood due to his father's job as a professor. He graduated from Bowdoin College with a Bachelor in Africana Studies in 2014 and proceeded to do an internship for his mother, filmmaker Mira Nair. After, he briefly formed a hip-hop duo with his childhood friend, performing under the alias Young and later Mr. Cardamom. Following this, he became a foreclosure prevention counselor in Queens and represented various neighborhoods in Queens in the New York Assembly in 2020. Slowly working his way upwards, he announced his candidacy as mayor of New York in October of 2024.
Back to his campaign. What made him stand out from all the other candidates?
Simple. He focused on affordability and the future rather than only the present. During his campaign, he promised an affordable New York with fare-free buses that'll move faster with the help of more priority lanes and jump signals. He promised to ban predatory contracts, hidden fees, open clauses, and general loopholes. He also stated he wanted to start a pilot project, creating city-owned grocery stores where prices can't inflate so that affordable local products can be sold there.
What are some further measures he would take?
For housing, he promised to freeze rents and build more affordable, rent-stabilized housing. He wanted to support homeowners in ending deed theft and fixing the tax system, as well as going against bad landlords by taking over repairs and sending the landlord the bill upon neglect and, in the worst cases, put the landlords out of business and, as the state, take over the properties. Regarding workers and labor, he wanted to raise the minimum wage to $30, protect workers and especially deliveristas. He also wanted to cut the fines of small businesses in half so more of them can open. Additionally, also continue fund libraries without funding negotiations having to be continued on them, subsequently making the workplace unstable. Furthermore, he promised to fund hospitals and create support in finding affordable health care, and lastly, guarantee reproductive care. For education and childcare, he promised free childcare for children aged 6 weeks to 5 years, public schools being funded so they can all have equal resources, and helping the lack of childcare workers and teachers by bringing up their wages and creating a program that helps fund their training. Though in turn, the participants must teach at a public school for at least 3 years. Lastly, he said he wanted to create baby baskets for new parents that contain essentials for babies, as well as a resource guide. Another big part of Zohran Mamdani's campaign was safety. In response to recent spikes in criminal activity and a lack of feeling of safety, he stated that he wanted to create a Department of Safety since the police haven't been able to take over the jobs that create this feeling of safety recently. He also wanted to create gun violence prevention programs and end all cooperation with ICE. Mamdani also explained that with recent developments of the recession of gender affirming care and more discrimination in hospitals, workplaces, and public spaces against queer folk through Trump's admission, he wants to create an Office of LGBTQIA plus affairs and expand and protect gender affirming care by funding things like mental health services, administrative and coordination costs, new health care, new education, etc. He also wanted to work on decarbonization and climate resiliency by, for example, creating an all electric building act. All of this should be funded using tax money of the wealthiest 1% of New Yorkers.
Mamdani went into office on January 1st, so which of these goals has he already accomplished?
He has already managed a lot in regard to affordability, labor, and transport. Taxes have been cut, inflation refund checks made, affordable housing plans advanced by authorizing and launching various projects, minimum wage has been raised, 50,000 new jobs created, and $760 million donated to small businesses. A congestion pricing program has been launched, and general, but especially public transport, advanced and expanded. For children and education purposes, school lunches have been made free, CUNY and SUNY programs have been launched that allow adults to go to college for free, and investments have already started going towards schools and colleges. Projects have been launched to expand youth sports and activities and to make them more accessible. Investments have been made into the childcare workforce, and general childcare and prenatal childcare has been expanded to 40 hours paid time off. A lot has also already been managed to ensure safety, such as $3 billion going into law enforcement and public safety, and $187 million into federal counterterrorism funding, gun laws, as well as bail and discovery laws and hate crime eligible offenses have been tightened. Additionally, the landmark John R. Lewis Voting Rights Act has been signed, and the aforementioned Office of LGBTQIA affairs has been established. Investments have been made into health and mental health care, and mental health emergencies responses have been expanded. Furthermore, insulin copays have been banned and healthcare workers have been placed under protection. In order to make New York more resilient towards climate change, a large nuclear plant is set to be built, and solar energy should further be expanded, and cyber protections are established to protect the functioning of these energy suppliers. Lastly, a tax has been established to tax the richest homeowners in New York, which don't even live in their properties and have therefore been profiting from them without actually doing anything useful with them, which, with the current housing situation in New York, is quite problematic.
But how has he managed to become so popular, even among the younger generations?
One thing that is really important for his plans is his online presence. By communicating each and every one of his decisions to the public via social media, he is also able to speak to the younger generations, those who often feel overlooked in politics. Now, let's move on to the debate. So, first question, how do you all feel about the way Mamdani is handling the cost of living in New York City right now? How about we hear from the left first?
I'm Philip, and I think the way Zoran is dealing with it right now is amazing because the rent freezes he's planning, free buses, and public grocery stores are a momentum we have never really seen before in the history of New York. And they're making the city a much more livable place than it has ever been. And she's also getting the budget from the right places with the pied-à-terre tax, for example. And I think it's inspirational for the rest of America too.
Hello, I'm Alex and I'm representing the political right in America. So first of all, we as the right also are very thrilled about the momentum right now in New York City and what Mamdani is doing right now. And we also feel for you that you're of course really supportive of your mayor right now, but we also have a few criticisms for your candidate and the things he wanted to implement. So for example, the rent freezing package is a bit problematic because the people who rent out the flats get disincentivized to rent out the flats because the profit margins are sinking, and therefore there will be less apartments available in New York City, and it will basically have the opposite effect of what you're hoping for. Also, the 5 city-run supermarkets are essentially a good idea, but they are not as good as they seem, as we can see, for example, by a also city-run supermarket in Kansas City, which has just lost funding after 10 years of support from the city, because the private retailers who basically run the supermarkets don't get any incentive to run it, as they don't get any stable income and the profits margins are so low. So overall, it's a really good idea, but as we can see in Kansas City, for example, it doesn't really work in practice.
As a centrist, I actually agree with the right and the left here, and I think overall that Zohran Mamdani's plan is actually quite decent, but there are like some gaps in his plan. It's not as foolproof as the left thinks it is. Firstly, I think the initiative to like uplift certain communities that have been disadvantaged is actually pretty good. But my main criticism is that there are a lot of New Yorkers that are technically above the poverty line. I think it's about 3.5 million New Yorkers that won't gain any of these extra welfare or subsidies, but they are still having an extremely hard time like affording New York, because it's a really expensive city. And I mean, it's good to help these small minorities, but I think Zohran is still ignoring the vast majority of people that still cannot afford New York. And I generally have this view on a lot of the policies. Like, they're all good ideas, but in practice, they can be executed a bit better. Like, for example, his new proposals on a $10 billion universal childcare plan is a good idea, but in reality it seems more like you're giving the money away, and it could be used to better those services instead of making them completely free, which I think is actually more important, since there have been studies in also different countries that have shown that making such amenities free actually also lowers the quality. I think Zohran Mamdani has done a lot of good things overall as well. For one, I think he actually delivers on a lot of the things he promises. He doesn't beat around the bush on certain topics like a lot of politicians do, especially the rent freeze thing. Even though I definitely do not agree with a blanket rent freeze, the fact that he's actually delivering on it is a big plus. Concerning the rent freeze thing, I actually agree with the right wing. I think that this blanket rent freezing is not good for the housing market, and it would reduce the supply of rental housing overall.
Although some of Mamdani's measures may have drawbacks, I would like to respond to the criticism on the rent freezes, because the goal of those freezes is not to kill housing entirely, but to relieve some of the pressure on tenants in New York. These rent freezes are a very targeted measure in a crisis. Landlords already have very high profit margins, and they can take hits because they have other sources of income, and the profit they earn already is very inflated. So by freezing rents, at least for a certain period of time, we can relieve some pressure where the people can't really take it. There are lots of tenants in New York that have to make ends meet every month and can't suffer another increase in rent. But the landlords can sustain that if their profit is slightly reduced for a while.
While yes, Philip, I definitely agree with trying to take the burden of middle class New Yorkers. I think the main problem with these rent freezes is that most of or not most, like half of the renting market or the housing market is not affected by these policies. It's because out of like the 2.3 million rental units, if I remember correctly, 1 million of them are market rate housing. That basically means the mayor's policies do not have a direct effect on them, and the rent freezes would not affect them. So basically, these policies only really affect about half of the rental units. I think the best solution is that developers should be basically forced to build new rental units via competition. And I think that's much more important for economic health.
So as Mukund already said, the main problem is not that it's not regulated, is that the regulations don't come in time or at all for the tenants of the units. And in the long term, if we are doing these freeze, it will actually worsen the situation, because the investors in these apartments or housing units don't get as much incentives to invest, which will in the long term make the housing situation worse, because the demand is growing steadily and the supply is dwindling as the investors are not investing anymore. And for that reason, we of course want to take the pressures off the shoulders of the tenants, but I think there's a better way to do that instead of rent freezes.
So to summarize all of this, we can say that the left agrees with Zohran Mamdani's policy or policies, while the right sees long-term issues with it and generally would change something about it. And the center thinks it's decent, but also thinks that there are long-term issues being created. Next, I would like to know all of your opinions on the city-owned grocery stores that should be opened. Let's start with the left again.
From a more left-wing perspective, I certainly support this decision because the idea is very appealing to introduce a non-profit-driven competitor into a market like NYC, where food affordability is a real issue that's threatening many citizens of the city. Well, I think that the idea is ideologically perfectly fine. There may be some issues we would encounter, such as the low profit margins, but this has been tried before, and although it's more of a optimistic experiment than a guaranteed measure, it's an experiment that can at least provide a affordable alternative for the New Yorkers that are struggling right now for a few years.
While we think it's a bold and great idea that we can focus on the affordability of groceries in New York, we as a right wing don't really support this idea as a Hail Mary solution for all the problems, because as we can see from numerous examples such as Kansas City, where a city-owned grocery store has been closed after 10 years of continuous funding, it doesn't really work. Because there is no incentive to make a profit, people who run the store don't really have any motivation to do so. So after a few years, they might move out and the city will have to resort to operating the store, which is highly unprofitable.
As a centrist, I tend to agree with the right wing more on this, and I also think the left wing having the idea to subsidize the really, really expensive groceries is actually a pretty good idea. In my opinion, the most ideal solution would be to give these subsidies or this money to small mom and pop businesses instead of trying to open the city's own grocery stores. Since, as the right wing already mentioned, opening up these big chain stores which don't even really operate on the principle of supply and demand would really drive these small businesses out of business, and that wouldn't really be ideal for the city's economy. So I think the best idea would be to try to fund these local shops, to uplift them, and to also drive competition.
Responding to that, I would like to point out that $760 million have already been invested in supporting those local stores. And as we can see with the current grocery situation in the city, that hasn't really worked. Besides, this grocery store project is still just a pilot and isn't a headlong rush that will cost us all of our budget.
So while it is true that lots of money has been poured into the grocery prices in the recent years in New York, as we can see, it has been doing nothing but raise the prices even further. And we as a right still don't think that the stores are a viable solution. We think that the lower profit margins will deter the suppliers from supplying the store, thus also narrowing demand. And narrowing demand will lead to a death spiral in making the store more unprofitable than it already is. And thus the other local stores will win. So we as a right think the solution lies in deregulation and more competition.
So in total, the left supports this project and thinks it could be a good trial, while the right does not, and thinks that the reason why these grocery stores are being opened up in the first place, so that the prices are stable, are going to get even higher due to all of the money being put into these stores. And the center thinks it is a good idea, but the money should rather be put into small businesses and direct benefits. So, my next question would be regarding something very recent. During Mamdani's campaign, he promised to tax the rich, which recently has gone into effect as stated before. But what do all of you think about that?
So we as a right don't think that the taxes are a viable way to get more money, as it has already seen in many cities around the world that the richest of the rich will leave, and then the tax revenue from the city will decrease even further, sending the city in a downward spindle. And it is not a good idea to mess with the taxpayers who pay the most taxes and therefore hold your city afloat, and it's generally not a good idea.
I would like to respond from the left standpoint with a question, which is how do you leave a city that you've already left? Because specifically the tax that Mamdani has introduced is targeting only the richest of the rich that have already left their properties in NYC vacant and live somewhere else and are just profiting off of those properties without doing anything with them. We believe that this tax is a great way to expand the city's budget and either make those people sell their properties to be used in the city or to uphold the city's budget with the revenue generated by that. It targets really only the richest, which are those who own properties above $5 million in value. So this ensures that it doesn't hurt the middle class.
I believe that the left actually is kind of in the right here, because there has been a recent poll, I think it was done a month or so ago, that has actually shown that around 62% of New York's millionaires would not actually mind the slight increase in taxation.
So, as you have said correctly, the tax will only affect those who don't live in the city right now and will free up rent space. But my question for you is, how will an average middle class man in New York City afford a $5 million apartment? He won't. So, is it really sensible to argue here that someone from the middle class will buy a 5 million apartment and therefore this apartment can be put into the market? If you have that money, you have the resources to buy another apartment that is freely available in New York City. It's not the ultra wealthy properties that are really in demand or that have a low supply. And also, this is only the first law and the first tax increase on the wealthy, and we can't afford to lose them, as they, as I've already said, bring in lots of tax revenue. And if they see, or if they get more pressured to pay more taxes in the long term, because Mamdani has already proposed more taxes on them, they might, as I said, leave the city.
I actually have a very quick response to your question, which is that our goal is not for the average middle class person to buy a $5 million apartment, but for the people who do to either live in New York or support New York by paying taxes for said property. Additionally, as Mukund has already mentioned, a lot of rich people in New York are actually quite fine with being taxed, and therefore they won't be pressured that much to leave the city.
Overall, the left thinks that this is a great opportunity to, in case of the rich actually giving these apartments back to the city, for them being able to be used differently, or the money that ends up being taken in via the tax being able to be used for other projects or being able to be invested in anything else. While the right thinks that this is not a viable method, since it could cause the rich to leave, which eventually will cause the tax revenue to decrease, which the middle class is going to have to pay for. And the center lies in the center between these two, thinks that overall this is a good idea and argues with the fact that most millionaires have agreed that they would be fine with paying further taxes, but also fears that some of the rich will leave, which will cause the tax revenue to decrease.
And with that, our episode on Zohran Mamdani comes to an end. We hope you enjoyed it as much as we enjoyed making it, and that you now know more about the current political situation. If you would like to listen to more podcasts, you can find more episodes on our channel. Until next time, we wish you a great rest of your day.